In the pantheon of history, we've had great rivalries. We've had Troy versus Sparta. We've had Pepsi versus Coke. We've had the Yankees versus the Red Sox, the Celtics, and the Lakers. And once upon a time, Marvel versus DC was an important rivalry, obviously in comic books, but just in, American pop culture and entertainment. But it seems to have all but died over the past decade. Perhaps it started earlier. I'm not really sure. So I brought in somebody that has opinions on comic books and loves history. That is the X-Men historian, the Marvel aficionado himself. Doc, how you doing, buddy?
I'm wonderful, sir. Thanks for doing this. This one's one that I've always loved. I've always loved having that rivalry. It still lives today inside of me. I am the embodiment of the Marvel versus DC rivalry.
It seems like it was so important for such a long time. But before we get into the details, I do want to say, if you're enjoying the channel, you like comic book reviews, news, opinion, this is probably a channel for you. Subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and definitely stick around with us. So, I don't know, Doc. Back in the day, you would have Stan Lee throwing shade over at DC Comics, called him the distinguished competition. You would have, the two publishers would try stealing talents and whatnot and try to upstage each other at conventions and stuff like this. And maybe, who could make a knockoff of the other team's characters and maybe make them look bad and stuff like that. They don't even do anything like this anymore. It almost feels like they've decided to become one very bland vanilla, it's the same publisher no matter where you go nowadays. There's almost no distinction between the two brands anymore. I think that has absolutely destroyed the rivalry, but it feels like this is on purpose.
I feel like it is. It started when, for the longest time, like the original rivalry, the people that were there, that were on the DC side and that were on the Marvel side, they were the goddamn lifers. They were, Stan was never going to leave Marvel to go to DC. Dick Giordano.
He did.
Well, yeah, I know. You know what I mean. But,
I gotcha.
Dick Giordano was not coming to Marvel. They were set in where they were at. Jack was never going to DC until he did. And, other guys from DC were never coming to Marvel until they did. So you started with that like 60s, they were never going. And then like the kids that grew up on the Marvel books, they went to Marvel and worked there. The kids that grew up on DC books, they went to DC and that's where they worked. And they have no real interest in going to the other company. And then you started seeing it in the 80s with a lot more talent kind of bouncing back and forth every so often. The 90s talent was generally kind of working for both at the same time, but then they split back out. That's when you started getting like the exclusives, and you ended up with people like Joe Quesada that really did try to bring back that Marvel versus DC rivalry. He would throw some
we've heard the story about Quesada when he found out that who was it, Grant Morrison, had signed a DC exclusive without letting them do a counter offer, and essentially he announced it within minutes after telling him. Apparently he lost his gasket because the rivalry felt important to him.
It did. But then he kind of, after he left that EIC position and went to that C-suite exec position that he ended up in, Axel Alonso grew up a DC guy. He was a Vertigo like head editor, and then he came over to Marvel. So he was always a DC guy that ended up running Marvel after Joe left. Jim Lee was a Marvel guy through and through, like grew up feeling like he wanted to be the next Stan Lee. He wanted to be Stan Lee. He wanted to run Marvel Comics. And according to Rob Liefeld on Rob's podcast, he was like days away from it actually happening before it kind of got pulled out from under him. And he ends up running DC. CB Cebulski is way too much of a, too affable of a guy. He's only interested in his anime and his, lunch and dinner. But, so it's hard for those guys that grew up like hardcore one company and came up through one company and then ends up running another company to really like throw shade. Plus the fact that, they kind of started bringing back a lot of the rivalry in the early 2000s with all the exclusive contracts. People got, Brian Bendis was a hardcore Marvel guy for so long because he was under that exclusive deal. But then it started becoming clear they were only loyal. It's like sports, like athletes. It's rare these days to see an athlete that is actually loyal to a particular team. It's just they're loyal to whoever's paying them. And that's
rare for a team to be loyal to an athlete. You saw what happened. It is. Remember Isaiah Thomas with the Boston Celtics? He, basically, 5'10", averages like 27 a game, takes him to the Eastern Conference Finals, and they trade him the next year. Everyone was pissed. Like, how can you do it to this guy? They're like, oh, it's just business. We had to get Kyrie Irving.
Yeah, exactly. Like you have that a lot in sports. The teams aren't loyal to the players, and the players stopped being loyal to the teams. And it's happened the same way in comics. And now, with
the way that this has happened, I think there's been a great detriment to the customers, in the retailers.
There has.
Because there's not this great rivalry. Nobody's trying to outdo themselves. Nobody's trying to have the best-selling comic. They just want to keep getting paid. Hey, I got a page rate. It doesn't. I guess they don't think they're going to make their royalty deals or whatever. But it doesn't feel like anyone's going out there and be like, you know what? Fuck DC Comics. I'm going to write a better version of this than they did. Or fuck Marvel. I'm going to have the coolest crossover event. They're not going to be able to touch me for this month. I think they're just trying to survive together.
Well, they can't because exclusives sort of kind of almost basically went away, and any exclusives that exist out there is an exclusive in name only. And half the creators out there are writing for both companies at the same time. Steve Orlando's coming over to Marvel, but he ain't stopping doing his DC work. Even when Bendis
DC work.
Well, not right. He probably doesn't have anything on the schedule right now, but
I don't think he's exclusive though.
No, he's not exclusive to anybody. You have
we got T.D. Howard coming over to Catwoman. Like how bad can you fail at Marvel Comics? DC Comics, the rivalry is so dead that they're taking Marvel's leftovers. Fucking Matthew Rosenberg is all over DC Comics solicitations now. Why are they taking all the shittiest writers at Marvel? Is it because they're cheap? I think so.
Well, yeah, but I think part of it is also that they're with the writers working at both companies. They don't give a shit. They're not out there they're not trying to embarrass the competition because the competition is themselves. They're not putting in the work. They're not putting in the effort because fuck it. I'm going to get paid. Even if Marvel doesn't give me a new book this month, DC will. And if DC doesn't, Marvel will. They don't give a shit anymore. And they can't go and try to embarrass like the competition by just totally blowing something out of the water, because that means that it probably doesn't want to pay, the competition isn't going to give them their book next month.
And essentially, the creators have been disincentivized by the publishers anyway. You can write the greatest story of all time, and they might make $1 billion on it when they turn it into a movie or something, and they're not going to compensate you for it anyway. So why would you even give away your best ideas or your coolest storylines that you can come up with? You want to build your reputation up, and hopefully you can go cash in on yourself someplace else.
Well, yeah, you're not wrong. I mean, like, look, this is back to the sports analogy. These companies aren't loyal, so the employees stopped being loyal too. They're not doing right by them. You see this a lot in overall business. The chronic job hoppers, they don't stay more than 2 years at any place. They just go do 2 years at a company, find another company looking to hire for a slightly higher position. Everything, they just use it as stepping stones. Each job, They have no loyalty to the company. They have no loyalty to what they're doing. They don't really love what they're doing. They're literally just using it as a stepping stone until they max out somewhere. And then with comics, they will max out at Marvel and DC because they'll just keep getting little jumps in their pay until they become, but their sales don't go up. They don't actually accomplish anything more. And then they'll dip out for, you know, a Substack deal or a, you know, creator own book, jump to Netflix, something like that, because they know that, you know, these companies look at them like replaceable. So the creatives have started looking at the companies as replaceable, and it's basically two sides both looking at each other going, these hoes ain't loyal, and they wonder why that this is what happens. Like, you know, yeah, somebody needs to change the direction here, and honestly it needs to be the publishers. If they want some loyalty out of and good product and maybe some competition back between them and their major competition, they might need to start being loyal to their employees here.
Also, you know, a little shots fired every once in a while. You know, say something that could be construed as disrespectful. You know, make it seem like it's a competition to be the top publisher within comic books, or you know, have the best brand or brand loyalty among customers. But I just don't think they care about that. I'll be honest, Doc. If there's a rivalry in comic books right now, I think it's with DC and Marvel versus the fans.
Yes.
Which I think is really, really strange, because it's the fans, you know, obviously, that are, you know, essentially funding this operation.
Yeah. I mean, it's DC and Marvel. It's like an evil empire of DC and Marvel and the creatives all deciding to team up to take on their customers. Why they thought this is a brilliant idea, I have no goddamn clue, but it's like that's where the rivalry is. The rivalry is between them and shit that they published 20 years ago, and people that like the shit they published 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Yeah, exactly, because they actually are losing. You know, it's a bunch of people that don't know comics, running comics, that are turning around and getting defensive when you say, hey, by the way, you guys don't know fucking comics. Well, you know what?
You don't maybe learn anything like that. You have like so many creators out there just almost on a daily, but seems like it's daily. Maybe it's more weekly, but like chastising their own customers, like talking down to them. Is like, who the fuck is VIL? She's never sold a comic book.
Yeah.
Maybe she got lucky and got put on a comic book that had an inherent amount of sales that were okay, but that VIL's name has never elevated the sales on anything. And if anything, it's always dropped sales, but somehow VIL is empowered to, because they're in a competition, you know, with the customers, to just talk shit on the customers rather than maybe throwing a little bit of shade over at the competition. But unfortunately, because they're VIL, they work at all the publishers.
Yes.
Maybe that's the problem. I mean,
yeah, that is the problem. They work they're working at both publishers simultaneously. So if I'm gonna shit on DC while promoting my Marvel work, do you know what DC, you know, and I'm currently also writing something at DC, you know what DC's gonna do? They're gonna stop hiring me, or they're gonna fire me off the book I'm at. Like, I mean, come on. So yeah, you're right. I mean, Vita and Tinney and Jerry Duggan and a number of other creatives in comics, you know, they've never put one ass in a fucking seat. They are Jeff goddamn Jarrett. But you know what? It's like they all learned from Jeff Jarrett. You know, motherfucker never drew a single seat and still thinks he can talk shit to the creators.
Jeff Jarrett made his own wrestling company, made himself champion.
Yeah, twice. But no, like,
here's the thing, Di. It's like the competition. If there is a competition even anymore, it's between the creators, like who can talk the most shit on their customers, or perhaps who can completely alter and fuck up the characters that the customers actually like. And it almost feels like they take glee in it nowadays.
Well, it's a look, those who can't do teach, and those who can't even teach destroy. These are people that can't write, and they're not good enough to be writing teachers, so they just break shit that somebody else made. Because it's easy. It is. It's really easy to break shit that somebody else destroyed. Look, I mean, I can't say that I haven't gone out and, you know, with my friends in a drunken stupor in, you know, the follies of my youth, kind of had little competitions to see who could fuck more shit up that night. We do that, but these people do it professionally. It's like their friendly competition is to see how much they can piss off the people that keep them employed while keeping themselves employed. That's like the goal. It's like they are like playing the world's longest game of I'm not touching you with the fans. Except for every time mom and dad turns around, they turn around and slap us. And then when we say, fine, we're not going to give you fucking money anymore, they just call you racists.
All I know is the comic book industry will be much healthier. When I say comic book industry, I'm talking about traditional Western superhero comics, DC, Marvel, you know, in the indie scene there. I'm not talking about the manga and graphic novel, YA graphic novel and stuff. It's going to be much healthier when there's a little bit of competition, when there's that rivalry back, when there's a you know, quite frankly, an EIC that has a fucking spine at Marvel Comics that actually wants to do better than DC Comics, or when there's an actual publisher over at DC Comics that has in their mind that success is doing better than Marvel and having your customers happier than Marvel's customers and having them come over and take a peek. That is not the case right now. It's been the detriment to the entire industry, specifically to the customer. There's very little customer satisfaction, you know, that goes into comic books right now. And I think it's because it's quite apparent they don't give a shit. They don't even want to compete against each other anymore. They're just sitting there, you know.
No, all their creative competition kind of chops are getting used to piss on fans, because if they used it against the competition, they wouldn't work. I mean, look, as much as we want to bitch about Joe Quesada and Dan Didio and Paul Levitz, when Didio and Levitz were at DC and Quesada was running Marvel, there was a straight up rivalry. You could look at the mid 2000s. There was a lot of, you know, the early 2000s, mid 2000s. There was a lot of creative juices flowing, and there was a lot of critically acclaimed and fan, not just critics. I'm talking about like actual customer, you know, satisfaction out of the stuff that Marvel and DC were doing. Now, did they start just doing too much of it and go into the well? Yeah. Those three individuals running those two companies really needed to learn some fucking moderation. But when there was, you know, you know that Didio and Levitz were sitting there fucking fuming and pushing their creators to do something amazing to blow Marvel's out of the water after Joe Quesada says in an interview that DC Comics is like a porn star with the biggest dick on the planet that can't get it up, talking about Superman and Batman. And you know that there is no way that does not chap the ass of Didio and Levitz, and that they are pushing. That's why you get like them doing like the 7 Soldiers of Victory. That's why you get them doing 52 and Countdown and Infinite Crisis. Now, they could have fucking stopped there and started going into more creative things, but those things worked, so they just started repeating them over and over. And Marvel saw that, you know, Civil War and House of M were successful, so they just kept doing those same things over and over. But at the same time, they pushed each other to be so much better. And you know who benefited from it? Not only their own wallets, but us customers.
Absolutely. So I think it's something it's quite evident right now. There is no competition. There's no rivalry between DC and Marvel. I think they're kind of, I think they feel like they're in it together. They're like one entity, and you know, it's had a very negative effect. I do want to say thank you very much to Doc, and I really appreciate your time, brother.
Oh, anytime, brother.